Russia's Vladimir Putin is threatening nuclear war.
President Biden comes to Europe when nuclear war is a possibility.
Might be time to restock the fallout shelter. Vladimir Putin just threatened nuclear war.
There's a huge possibility about a third world war.
7 in 10 people fear the possibility of a nuclear war.
This is not the first time we've faced a potential nuclear war. Decades ago, during the Cold War, the fear of nukes was everywhere.
Always remember, the flash of an atomic bomb can come at any time, no matter where you may be.
Potentially a little too much paranoia.
9, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Maybe. But at least our government was talking about the threat and what it meant. At least Americans were preparing for any possibility. At least we had a plan. But now, nothing. Nada. Silence from those who we've elected to keep us safe, to warn us, and to prepare us for all scenarios possible. But it's time to wake up. America, nuclear war is quickly becoming one of those serious possibilities again, like it or not. Tonight, I will show you how real the danger is, despite the secrecy from Washington, D.C. Tonight, Nuclear War 101. How to prepare for the horrifying reality of nuclear war. Hello, America. The one thing I do not want to do today is to create the kind of feelings that I had when I was a kid. I grew up in the 70s and early 80s, and I remember being terrified of nuclear war. But we were very well aware of what it was. I don't want to bring fear. I want to bring information so you can prepare yourself in any way you see fit, at least with knowledge. In Great Britain, the government has already told its people to prepare and start to look fallout shelters, et cetera, et cetera. The Swiss, just 6 months ago, they made it mandatory that you go into your fallout shelter, because it's mandatory from the 1950s and 60s to have a fallout shelter, and make sure that everything is stocked up with fresh water and fresh food. This is a reality in Russia. They are doing the same thing. They are cleaning up the old fallout shelters and making sure that the people understand. Here in America, we're not talking about it. Now, let me show you just a quick horror here. Over 1.5 million people, that's how many Americans would die instantly if a nuclear bomb exploded over New York City. There is a website that has an interactive map. It was created by Alec Wellerstein. He's a professor at Stevens Institute of Technology. And this interactive map allows you to zoom in anywhere in the U.S. to see the scope of the area that would be affected by a nuclear blast. It's a rabbit hole that is a little grim, but a little addicting too. Now, this is an example from an 800-ton kiloton bomb, which is currently the Russian arsenal. It is 38 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped in Nagasaki. If Russia launched one of its land-based nuclear missiles, we'd have about 30 minutes to prepare. If Russia launched from a submarine, we could have 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. Just 2 weeks ago, a former Russian army commander said this on Russian TV.
Я больше чем убежден, пока эти друзья ядерные бомбы по куполу не получат, ничего совершенно не образумится. И когда мы эту тему раз или иначе поднимали, но по-другому с этими дураками разговаривать невозможно. Победим 100%. А где? Везде. Везде. И дело далеко не в Украине. Везде. Россия была, есть и будет великой. Мы должны сделать выводы, чтобы когда-то в 45-м до конца не додавили. Сегодня мы должны додавить так, чтобы больше этой угрозы никогда и беды для нашей страны не было.
We will win war everywhere. Last month, the chairman of Russia's Security Council said this, quote, "The loss of a nuclear power that's Russia or us, in a conventional war, meaning the current war in Ukraine, could provoke a nuclear war. Nuclear powers have not lost major conflicts on which their fate depends. And this should be obvious to everyone. We all know that a serious war between us and Russia, never fought directly before, if we're saying that it is the toppling of their government is our out, if they feel like they are going to be toppled, well, let me reverse it. If we felt we were going to be toppled and lose to the former Soviet Union, would we launch? I know this is insane talk, and hopefully it's just bluster, but these are now threats that we have never faced before, a direct war with a nuclear power, and it has to be taken seriously. Americans used to understand this. For about half a century, we had a healthy fear of nuclear Armageddon because we witnessed it firsthand in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. Here's a survivor from Hiroshima describing what she saw.
Outside her house, the survivors began to gather, their faces burned and swollen. They begged for water.
Their skin was peeling off and hanging. And at first, I saw some, and I thought they were holding something, or the rag or something, but that was really skin.
This colour footage of victims taken in 1946 was classified until the 1980s.
Just 4 years later, the Soviets developed their first nuclear weapon. So you know, their first nuclear weapon, they stole the information from us through spies. And into the 1950s, we feared we were falling behind the Soviets because of something called Sputnik. Watch.
The Soviets said the kind of rockets which have taken Sputnik up could also carry nuclear weapons in space. They were using Sputnik to try to scare the United States, to scare Americans into the idea that we were all in danger of some Soviet nuclear weapon coming from space.
Watch the person watching right here. This is what Americans were doing. They were looking to the heavens and they were looking at this. This is one of the three prototype Sputniks. The one that actually went up into space, burned up on re-entry. The National Air and Space Museum in Washington has one. The Russian Soviet Space Museum has one. And Mercury now has one as well. This was terrifying. And those fears were not irrational. In 1961, Russia detonated something they called the Tsar Bomba, which means king of bombs in Russian. The test was done over an island in the Arctic Ocean, and it was the largest nuclear weapon ever set off. Now, this is a 50 megaton blast. That is 3,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima. Its mushroom cloud was 130,000 feet tall. To give you some perspective, that's 4.5 times the height of Mount Everest. That same year, Congress funded a national fallout shelter program in which schools and other public buildings were identified as appropriate shelters in the case of a nuclear attack and stocked with supplies. By the time the federal funding stopped in the 1970s, New York City alone had 18,000 fallout shelters, marked with this, the famous yellow sign of a safe place in case of a nuclear war. Well, we knew about it and we were prepared. The same kind of stuff is now happening in Great Britain and in the former Soviet Union. We're just not doing it. The government produced a how-to guide, and they also provided a loan program to help people build their own backyard bomb shelters. They also produced films that train students, ridiculously, to do this in school if a nuclear attack were to happen.
First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck and your face.
When I was in school, I remember duck and cover. I thought it was nonsense then. Really? So I'll be vaporized under my desk instead of at my desk. The fear at the time was so strong, and maybe this is where we lost perspective, Maybe. It was so strong that I remember having nightmares every night when I was a kid for a while. We'd have to do some mandatory thing, and we would watch what nuclear war really meant, and it horrified us. If you've ever been to Disneyland, this is the original map of Disneyland that was first sketched out by Herb Ryman and then hand-colored by Walt Disney. What people don't really understand is the berms that go all the way around Disneyland. Yes, it is true that Walt Disney wanted to make sure that nobody would see McDonald's or, you know, the outside world from inside the park. That's why he built these berms. But it is a theory of mine that it also played a secondary role along with Main Street USA. Main Street USA at the time was not just a collection of stores where you could buy t-shirts. These were real, actual operating stores that was designed around his hometown around the turn of the century, 1900. That was before electricity. That was before radio. That was before really indoor plumbing in a lot of places. This was a world that somebody who was 50 years old could walk into, and they remembered when life was simpler and you weren't worried about Sputnik or things falling from the sky like nuclear bombs. It allowed the adults to relax and leave that world so their kids could eventually go into a world of magic. The fear was palpable at times. 1961, the same year the Soviets tested their king of bombs, we did something. We put our U.S. Strategic Air Command up in the sky. It was called Operation Looking Glass. The Air Force kept several planes in the air at all times to serve as the command and control center. This is for nuclear launches in case our land-based command centers were taken out in a nuclear attack. The Air Force kept these planes up in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day, for 29 years. The closest we came to a nuclear war was a 13-day standoff known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most Americans today just don't fully grasp how dire the situation was. I remember growing up and listening to an old Andy Williams album with my mom at Christmas time, and it had the song, "Do You Hear What I Hear?" I didn't know this until we were researching for this show, but that song was written by a husband and wife during the peak stress of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The line from that song, "A star dancing in the night with a tail as big as a kite," is referring to a nuclear missile, not a Star of Bethlehem. Which is why later in the song it says, "Pray for peace, people everywhere." The fear of nuclear war was very real to Americans. Now, let's fast forward. I'm 19 years old. We'll go 21 years in the future here, 1983, which is the most threatening year for nuclear war since 1962. I know I was living and working in Washington, D.C. I remember looking out my window and seeing the red lights on top of the Washington Monument and thinking, this might be the last thing I see. I might see a flash, and then we're all gone. 1983 does not get the same amount of attention as 62 does. Both sides were doing things to ratchet up the tension. Ronald Reagan was just starting his third year as president when he said this.
While they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Gosh, couldn't you take that speech and say that about us now? 2 weeks later, after he said that, Reagan announced that the U.S. was developing the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the media immediately called Star Wars. This freaked the Soviets out because if it could be done, it would totally change the balance of mutually assured destruction. Now, the Soviets thought this would free up the U.S. just to launch a nuclear attack. Well, incredibly, that September, the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner, KAL-007. It had entered Soviet airspace.
Fellow Americans,
I'm coming before you tonight about the Korean airline massacre, the attack by the Soviet Union against 269 innocent men, women, and children aboard an unarmed Korean passenger plane. This crime against humanity must never be forgotten.
Crime against humanity. I was just down the street from the White House when he said those words, and my mouth went dry. One of the victims killed in that attack was Larry McDonald. He was a Democratic U.S. congressman from Georgia. So this buildup throughout 1983 set the stage for a U.S. military exercise in Europe that November. Now, this simulated a nuclear attack on NATO countries. It was a gigantic, realistic exercise with a fleet of cargo planes transporting 16,000 U.S. soldiers to bases in Europe. B-52 bombers were loaded with dummy bombs. U.S. Strategic Air Command raised its nuclear alert to DEFCON 1, which means nuclear missiles are imminent. The Soviets were so paranoid that the U.S. could launch a nuclear attack under the guise of a military exercise that when they picked up the signals of massive troop movements, B-52s readying for takeoff, and unusual radio silence, even though we told the Soviets what we were doing, they ordered all of their air forces in Eastern Europe to make, quote, preparations for immediate use of nuclear weapons. Imagine. Real nuclear bombs were loaded onto Soviet planes, and they were ordered they ordered their nuclear-armed submarines into the Arctic. Ultimately, the U.S. did not overreact to the Soviets' overreaction, so when the NATO exercise ended, the Soviets snapped out of their paranoia and recalled their nuclear forces. But in a follow-up report on what was called the Soviet War Scare, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board said, and I quote, "In 1983, we may have inadvertently placed our relations with the Soviet Union on a hair trigger." No one outside the U.S. and Soviet leadership knew about this scare at the time. That's why I don't really remember this. Ironically, less than 2 weeks after the end of this near miss, I do remember something that was on television. It was a mini-series called The Day After. It aired on ABC about the start of the nuclear war with Soviets. Beside the cheesy effects of the time, it is a grim and realistic take on what full-scale nuclear war might look like. Almost half the country watched at the time. 100 million Americans watched The Day After. It is the most watched TV movie in history. And people were terrified.
Most of you who watched the ABC movie The Day After are probably still feeling just a little numb right now.
More than 700 people packed Riverside Church tonight to watch The Day After. Many said they came here because they were afraid to watch it alone.
I think it's gonna make people more aware of the catastrophic effects, and it's a lot of things to think about.
It was completely devastating. It was a horrible thing to see the reality and how fast it could happen.
Really happened. I just want to go die with the blast and not have to live and have to start all over again.
President Reagan saw the movie several months before it had aired on ABC, and after viewing it, he later wrote in his diary, quote, "It is powerfully done, very effective, and left me greatly depressed. My own reaction was one of our having to do all we can to have a deterrent and see that there is never a nuclear war." It was after that that really things started to change a great deal. And we no longer had books like this on thermonuclear war, which is, when we thought we could win a nuclear war. It talks about how much dirt, how much soil you have to remove before you plant seeds. We actually planned for survival. And that's one of the craziest things is the most surprising thing to most people, if God forbid it ever happens, is most of us survive, believe it or not. All right, to laugh this off as quaint, Cold War relic, old people stuff. People were so dumb and hokey back then. Really? That's a mistake. Have you looked at Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin lately? While I don't want to create any kind of nuclear hysteria, we do need a healthy fear that maybe at times we had in the 20th century. I'll look at the details of why next. Okay, your dog's life is about to get a whole lot happier and healthier. As a pet owner, that's what you want, right? That good boy or good girl is your best friend, after all, part of the family, and you really want him or her to live a long and happy life. Unfortunately, if you've been feeding your dog dry kibble food, it's not just getting them there. It's not. It lacks sufficient nutrition. Well, this is where naturopathic Dr. Dennis Black comes in. A few years ago, he created Rough Greens, and from personal experience with my own dog, Uno, I can tell you the stuff works wonders. It's not a dog food. You sprinkle it onto the dog food, and it'll give him all the essential vitamins and nutrients and probiotics, antioxidants, everything that your dog needs. All right? All you have to do is just give it a try with your dog. First, they want to make sure your dog likes it and will eat it. My dog loves it. Go to roughgreens.com/Beck. Get your first bag, trial bag, for free at roughgreens.com/Beck. Now, let me take you up and bring you up to speed on why you should be aware of what's going on. When the U.S. finally shot down that Chinese spy balloon a few weeks ago, the balloon had already traveled over Malmstrom Air Force Base, where 1/3 of our land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles are located. Then, strangely, the balloon traveled over 4 additional Air Force bases, including the headquarters of Strategic Command, which controls all U.S. nuclear weapons. But sure, they were just checking out the weather. It was just a mistake. Just a couple of weeks before the Chinese spy balloon incident, the U.S. Coast Guard was tracking a suspected Russian spy ship near Hawaii. Not that we should be surprised, since the U.S. keeps increasing our military role in Ukraine. Now, we also face the renewed possibility of Israel trying to take out Iran's nuclear program, because, according to recent reports, Iran has increased their uranium enrichment to 84%. This is absolutely unacceptable to Israel. They will be forced, and they will act. The question is how and when. The extra spice is Iran is now a close ally with China and Russia. 4 months ago, the president said that we would face a nuclear Armageddon if Putin uses a nuke on Ukraine. And yet this week, Biden shows up for a surprise visit in Kyiv to show that the U.S. is, quote, here to stay. Imagine if Brezhnev would have done that and went and visited Vietnam during the war. It feels to me like we are barreling down the road toward a disaster. Now, I want to be very clear. I do not support Russia. I don't want them to take over Ukraine, but I also don't support the dirty and corrupt government of Ukraine or our dirty and corrupt government here in America. I don't want a nuclear holocaust, and I'm for the people of all those countries, not for the leadership. Now, according to a new study of people in the U.S. and Britain, far too many people don't even understand what a nuclear disaster means. The survey asked people about their awareness of what nuclear winter would entail. Only 7.5% of Americans indicated they had heard of it through media or culture. Russia currently has under 6,000 Russian nuclear warheads in its arsenal. We have 5,400. A smaller tactical or battlefield nukes, Russia has about 2,000. We have 200. China currently has 350 nuclear warheads. But a Pentagon report last November warned that China is expected to increase that number to 1,500 by 2035. China is on a big military building spree. Now, just a few weeks ago, the Pentagon notified Congress that China now has more ICBM launch sites than the United States of America does. And in more happy good news, Russia and China are currently having a joint naval exercise with South Africa. Then, of course, there's also North Korea, which last year tested 90 ballistic missiles. That is far more than any other year in their history. On Monday, North Korea fired 2 more ICBMs into the Pacific in response to the latest military drills conducted by the U.S. and South Korea. North Korea warned of, quote, unprecedented strong responses if the drills continue. So what if one or more of these enemies decide to launch a nuke at the U.S. or just accidentally? The U.S. still has over 400 Minuteman ICBMs with nuclear warheads scattered in silos all across the West. They aren't on constant alert, but they could be ready within 2 minutes. The U.S. satellites would detect the enemy launch within a few minutes. NORAD officials would notify the president. The president would then remove the black book from the nuclear briefcase and review the options that are drawn with like cartoon-like illustrations. I'm not making this up. So they can just look at it and not get confused by big words. Which one? Blow up that person in that Russian hat. One former military aide described it as kind of like a breakfast menu at Denny's, except with bombs. The president would have just a few minutes to make a decision. Once launched, our missiles cannot be recalled. It's not encouraging to think the clock is ticking while our 80-year-old president fumbles through a nuclear comic book to figure out what to do. In the event of a nuclear attack, New York, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. are considered the most likely targets. But as this map shows, almost every state has a nuclear-related missile site. So even the most rural areas could be in danger during a full-out war situation. According to MIT, 10 seconds after 1 megaton nuclear explosion, the fireball is 1 mile in diameter. The initial fireball is many times brighter than the sun, even 50 miles away. The thermal flash lasts several seconds and can cause severe burns up to 20 miles away from the initial explosion. Direct radiation in the form of gamma rays and neutrons lasts under a second, but extends at least 1 mile in all directions from ground zero. So if you're exposed to something like this radiation causes symptoms like bloody diarrhea, hair loss, fever, intense thirst. Enough exposure kills people within days. The explosion also creates clouds of dust and sand-like particles that are all now radioactive. This is the fallout, and it can take 15 minutes to reach the ground. Remember, it goes up and then comes down, but it doesn't come straight down. Wind carries the fallout for hundreds of miles from ground zero. People 25 miles downwind from a blast would have less than 25 minutes to find shelter from the fallout. One estimate shows an attack on U.S. cities by 100 nukes of 1 megaton each would instantly kill up to 20% of our population. So you survive. But 1,000 nukes would immediately wipe out half the U.S. population. So half of us are still here. According to an MIT report, recent studies say nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia could release 150 million tons of smoke and soot into the upper atmosphere. Well, Bill Gates would not have to worry about global temperatures going up. This would drop the global temperature by 46 degrees. The smoke and soot would only allow 30 to 40% of sunlight to reach the Earth's surface for 6 months after the bombs drop. This is what nuclear winter is that most people seem to not know about anymore. Temperatures would drop below freezing even during the summer for several years. Worldwide food production would be reduced only by 90%. That means global famine. And that would kill 75% of the remaining world population that managed to survive the nuclear blast. A study published last year estimates 5 billion people could die from a nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia. Now, these studies look at the effects of multiple warheads, but the reality is that America is not even prepared for a single nuclear explosion. According to Columbia University professor who specializes in disaster preparedness, he said, quote, "There isn't a single jurisdiction in America that has anything approaching an adequate plan to deal with a nuclear detonation." Do you remember when we thought it was crazy that people would fly planes into buildings? At the beginning of the show tonight, I showed you that an 800 kiloton blast over New York City would kill over 1.5 million people. Another 3 million people would be injured. But the entire state of New York only has around 40,000 hospital beds, and that includes 4,400 ICU beds. By the way, I hope we don't need respirators because the mayor just sold $15 million of them at a discount because we don't need them anymore. Just one nuclear explosion could cause 10,000 severe burn cases. But the entire U.S. only has burn treatment centers that can handle less than 2,000 patients. We could not handle a single nuclear strike, much less a nuclear war. When you pause to examine what war like this would mean, it's overwhelming. And that's why we all thought we came to a point where we thought it will never happen. Sane people understand this. At the Geneva Summit in 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev issued a joint statement that, quote, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. But sanity seems to be in short supply these days, so the possibility of a nuclear attack cannot be dismissed. So what do? We'll go there next. So we just shot down that spy balloon. Now, that can mean many things. But I think it means that our relationship with China is not getting better. Now, according to the University of Minnesota study, the U.S. relies on overseas for 18 out of 21 critical antibiotics. Isn't that good? 72% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients, 72%, not from here. We don't make medicine here anymore, and that is really dangerous. If things escalated, I mean, you don't have to even go this far, but if we just had a breakdown of trade again with China, we would be looking at a severe antibiotic shortage. It's already happening on a small scale. What if it gets worse? That's where Jace Case comes in from Jace Medical, a great way to keep yourself prepared for the worst, or maybe even just the next vacation with the kids. It's a pack of 5 different courses of antibiotics that you can use to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses like UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, and a lot more. It's a great way to be ready for shortages or just for traveling. Listen, don't get caught unprepared. JaceMedical.com, J-A-S-E medical.com. Enter the promo code Beck at checkout for your discount on your order. That's promo code Beck at JaceMedical.com.
So there's been a nuclear attack. Don't ask me how or why, just know that the big one has hit, okay? So what do? There are 3 important steps that I want you to remember. Step 1, get inside fast. You, your friends, your family, get inside. And no, staying in the car is not an option. Don't go outside until officials say it's safe. All right? You've got this.
No, I don't think we've got this. No. First of all, why are you releasing this, New York City? Why just last year, after the war started, did they do this? Because I think it's a little creepy. I mean, they couldn't handle COVID-19 at all, but if there's a nuclear blast, no problem. You got this? Just stay inside, wait for instructions. I don't think so. The other reason you probably don't got this is like I was talking about before the break. If you live within a half a mile of ground zero, nothing survives the blast. The good news is, if you can't afford to move to one of those island nations, scientists have ranked the best places on Earth to survive a nuclear winter. And according to their calculations, New Zealand, Australia, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, best chance. Okay? All right. Your only choice is the Northern Hemisphere. That would be Iceland. So good luck with that. Now, maybe that's because it's already frozen, so what difference does it make? Nuclear winter might be less noticeable there, but I digress. If you have to stay in the U.S. with the rest of us schlubs, areas of northern Maine, southeastern Oregon, northern California, and West Texas are relatively safer because they're distant from big cities and military facilities. But the reality is that fallout would have the potential to reach pretty much every corner of the world, let alone the nation. The federal government's guide for emergency responders in a nuclear blast situation divides an area into damage and fallout zones. In the severe damage zone, up to a half-mile away from the blast, survivors are unlikely, and radiation is too high to enter for 72 hours. After 72 hours, those people are all dead. In the moderate damage zone, from half a mile to 1 mile from the blast, there are serious injuries, but, quote, best life-saving opportunities. In the dangerous fallout zone, 10 to 20 miles from ground zero, the government advises responders not to enter the zone without justification. Would that be like saving lives? Assuming you live outside the severe and moderate damage zones, maybe you live on Sesame Street, what should you do? Well, there are three main elements of a nuclear blast. The bright flash, don't look at it. The blast wave, don't try to surf it. And radiation, bad. If at all possible, make sure you don't look at the burst. It could cause permanent blindness. That would suck. It can temporarily blind you even up to 13 miles away on a clear day and up to 53 miles away on a clear night. So as soon as you can, get inside your house or a building, unless you're blind. Preferably something brick or concrete. Stay far away from windows or outer walls and the roof. If you have access to a basement, that's great. Underground is always going to be better. I mean, moles will survive. If that's not an option, get to the center of a building or house and sit in a stairwell. The primary concern if you're outside of the severe and moderate damage zones is avoiding the fallout. Once inside, turn off all the fans and the air conditioners and the heating units. Close the fireplace. It's going to get stuffy in there, but it's better than breathing in the stuff that makes you glow. You don't want to draw any more of the fallout inside, so stay inside. Keep everything closed for at least 24 hours. Now, you probably have to stay inside much longer than that, especially if Fauci is around. You'll never leave your house. But fallout does drop about 1% of its initial radiation level within 2 weeks. If you are caught outside during the blast, take cover behind something. Lay flat on the ground and cover your head. It could take up to 30 seconds for the blast wave to reach you. If you would survive the blast wave, your next priority is trying to limit the radiation exposure. Acute radiation sickness can damage the body enough to limit its abilities to fix itself or fight infections. Think, chemotherapy is great. Cover your mouth with some kind of cloth material. It'd be great if you were already been taken a hostage. Then get indoors as soon as you can. Remove your clothes. Yeah, you know where I'm going here. And seal them off in a plastic bag. Put the bag as far away from people as possible. Remove your clothes so you can reduce the fallout contamination by up to 90%. Blow your nose and wash out your ears in case there's any contaminated dirt particles. It's best to take a shower with plenty of soap and shampoo. Now, you're supposed to be careful not to scratch your skin, but if you do have scrapes, don't cover them. No, do cover them. No, is it don't or do? It's do cover them, but don't use conditioner because that could bind the radioactive particles to your hair, okay? Yes for covering wounds, no for conditioner on soap, on hair. Good luck. We're all going to be dead. Assuming you get inside and assuming you decontaminate yourself if you were outside after the blast, you're going to eventually need to eat. Who knew? It's okay to eat and drink anything that's in a sealed container. Package, bottles, cans. You can eat food from your pantry and refrigerator. All that soy sauce, have all of it you want. Any food left uncovered, even inside your house, and especially anything from the outdoor garden, not safe. You cannot boil water to get rid of radiation. But you can use tap water to wash dishes and take showers. Is this starting to sound like the instructions they're giving to people in Ohio right now? If the public water supply is contaminated from fallout, the water dilutes the radiation enough to keep it from being harmful. Finally, remember that you're going to have to contend with an EMP blast in a nuclear explosion. So make sure you have some batteries or backup power available. even though this is ridiculous as it will fry every chip in everything. But have some batteries available. A battery-operated or hand crank radio might be essential. Yes, 20th century technology is the only thing going to work for a while, and maybe a very long while. If there is still a chance we won't have to deal with this, it would be great. But the best chance of survival is next. Let me tell you, the only way to avoid all of this stuff is turn back to the Lord. I'm just saying, turn back to God. Hey, really, really sorry. Could you help us now? And you know, a lot of people are calling down blessings, I believe, right now. You are a hero. The donations that you are giving to the good work of Preborn is saving lives. Right now, there are babies that are taking their first breath. Today, 150 taking their first breath because of you. Babies need our help. The overturning of Roe versus Wade has only made the left even more ravenous for blood. Thanks to Preborn, the pregnancy network, we can help. For $28, you can introduce an at-risk baby to their mom. It's the cost of a dinner to save a life. Once that mom, even if she comes in and says, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have an abortion, when she hears the heartbeat and sees the baby on the ultrasound, she is twice as likely to choose life. That happens because of you. Preborn rescued over 200,000 babies from abortion in just the last few years. Their clinics save 150. We saved 50 or 60,000 babies, just this audience last year. You want some divine protection? Let's save a few more babies. Dial pound 250 baby or go to preborn.com/Glenn. That's preborn.com/Glenn.
Remind us that freedom is priceless. It's worth fighting for as long as it takes. And that's how long we're going to be with you, Mr. President, for as long as it takes.
We'll do it.
Thank you.
I like it when he calls world leaders pal. President Biden just committed to the United States to indefinitely fund and supply the Ukrainian people in its war with Russia, as long as it takes. We're also paying their pension funds. That sounds great. I can understand the rationale that it is better to spend billions in a war to aid Ukraine than sacrifice any American soldiers. What is harder to understand is why we keep ratcheting this up to the point of no return, where we are the leaders of this war. Putin is the evil aggressor here. But at the same time, Congress, our representatives, are not in the driver's seat of this vehicle, screaming down the road toward an all-out war. Last October, U.S. Health and Human Services bought $290 million worth of radiation sickness drug known by the brand name Nplate. It is used to reduce bleeding caused by exposure to radiation from a nuclear explosion. In a statement, the HHS said, quote, "This is part of our ongoing work for preparedness and radiological security. It has not been accelerated by the situation in Ukraine." They really think we're this stupid? All those millions of dollars, and it lasts only like 18 months. Oh, yeah. It's comical. This point, government agencies expect us to accept things like this. We need to trust our agencies, but there's not transparency, and they're really bad liars. Their track record is so bad at this point, how do you even begin to start to rebuild trust? Even if HHS is being completely honest, this is just business as usual and has nothing at all to do with Ukraine and Russia. The timing is a bit suspicious. And have we been spending that much money for the last 30 years on it? I don't think so. Just as Team Biden takes our involvement in Ukraine to the next level, we also happen to buy almost $300 million of radiation sickness pills. What? We just ended a 2-decade war in Afghanistan. Very poorly, by the way, thanks to Joe Biden's White House. Most Americans are not interested in jumping into another long-term war, especially with 2 nuclear powers who have never fought, and both of them are saying the only way this is going to end is if one of them fall, either them or us. The new AP poll released last week finds that less than half of Americans are now in favor of the U.S. providing weapons to Ukraine. Last May, 60% approved sending weapons. According to this poll, we're equally divided on sending money. 37% in favor, 38% opposed, and 23%, I don't know. Now, this is not exactly a mandate for us to stay involved as long as it takes. Our leaders don't trust us to know about national security threats. That's why we've had to find out about these Chinese spy balloons from a Montana man who took pictures of it. Any national security decisions with war implications should never be a surprise to the American people. They should never creep up on us, and they should never rest in the hands of a small group of people. According to our Constitution, Congress is the only one who has power to declare war. But for decades, we've been treating that as a technicality that can easily be sidestepped. After FDR's Day of Infamy speech in 1941, Congress voted on his request to declare war. That's how it works. But World War II was actually the last time we formally declared war. In fact, Congress has only officially declared war 11 times in our history. War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, 2 separate World War declarations, one for Germany, one for Austria-Hungary, 6 separate declarations for World War II, Japan, Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania. We never declared war after that, not in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, none of it. The closest they got was an authorization for use of military force. Definitely not a war. But now the foes we're dealing with are nuclear powers. And as you've seen tonight, kind of zero margin for error. In fact, an error could trigger a nuclear holocaust. Your life, everything you know and love, is in the hands of whom? Joe Biden, hey pal. Antony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, Jake Sullivan. Are these the people you want making life and death decisions against nuclear powers on the behalf of a nation of 330 million people? This is your life. This is your country. This is your decision. We have to let our voices be heard and demand that Congress take the reins on this. Do your job. Debate. Who knows? I might change my mind. But no sneaking around. No quiet backroom deals. Period. We want an open discussion, total transparency, not a war based on the whims of progressive elites in the White House who are much more freaked out about racial equality than a nuke landing in your backyard. Good night, America.